They destroyed 12 graves for a golf course. But what happened next cost them every home they had the day the bulldozers crossed the line didn't. It began with noise. It began with a phone call, one of those early morning calls that instantly tells you something is wrong before a single word is spoken. I remember staring at the screen for a second too long before answering, a strange heaviness settling in my chest. On the other end was Mr. Havorson, a man who rarely called anyone unless it mattered. His voice was shaking, not with anger, but something deeper, disbelief. "They're redigging it up," he said. "The cemetery. They're re-tearing it up." At first, I thought there had to be some mistake. The small patch of land behind the old Oak Ridge wasn't just any forgotten corner of the neighborhood. It was a protected site, or at least it was supposed to be. 12 graves rested there, some marked, some worn down by time, all carrying names tied to families who had lived on that land long before the HOA ever existed. It wasn't just history, it was sacred ground. By the time I got there, the silence I expected was gone. The low growl of heavy machinery filled the air, shaking the ground beneath my feet as I stepped out of my car. 2 bulldozers were already at work, their steel blades cutting into the earth with brutal indifference. Piles of dirt had been pushed aside, and what stopped me cold wasn't just the destruction, it was what lay mixed within it. Broken headstones, splintered wood, fragments that should never have seen daylight again. I walked closer, my heart pounding harder with every step. A construction supervisor stood nearby, clipboard in hand, watching it all like it was just another job site. When I demanded to know what was happening, he barely looked up. "HOA approved expansion," he said flatly. "We re-clearing the area for the new golf course extension." I felt something snap inside me. "That's not just area," I told him, pointing toward the churned-up ground. "That's a cemetery." He shrugged, like I'd just complained about a misplaced fence. "We were told it's unused land." Orders came from the board. Unused land. The words echoed in my head as I looked around again, this time noticing the details I hadn't wanted to see at first. A cracked headstone with a date from the 1800s. A rusted iron marker bent in half. And then something worse, a partially exposed coffin edge, splintered open by the blade of a machine that didn't care what it hit. That's when the anger truly set in. This wasn't ignorance. This wasn't an accident. Someone had signed off on this. Someone had looked at this land, at those graves, and decided they didn't matter anymore. More residents began to gather, drawn by the noise or the rumors spreading through the neighborhood. Some stood in stunned silence. Others started shouting, demanding answers that no one on site could or would give. One older woman dropped to her knees near the edge of the torn ground, crying as she tried to brush dirt away from a broken marker with her bare hands. And still, the machines didn't stop. I pulled out my phone and started taking photos, documenting everything, the damage, the equipment, the workers, every single detail. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't going to be resolved with a simple complaint or a strongly worded email. This was bigger than that. This was a line that should never have been crossed. And once I saw the extent of it, I understood something else just as clearly. Whoever made this decision thought no one would fight back. They thought they could erase a piece of history, flatten it, and build something shiny on top of it without consequences. They thought the people living here either wouldn't notice or wouldn't care enough to do anything about it. Standing there, surrounded by the destruction, I made a quiet promise to myself. They were wrong. They thought no one would notice. That was the part that kept repeating in my head as I stood there, staring at the torn-up ground where history had once rested in peace. It wasn't just the destruction that unsettled me, it was the quiet, calculated way it had been done. No announcements, no warnings, no community vote. Just early morning machinery and a decision buried as deep as the graves they had just disturbed. By the time I left the site, the damage had already been done. But something about the way the supervisor had brushed me off didn't sit right. Unused land, he had said, like it was a line he'd been told to repeat without question. That wasn't a misunderstanding, that was a script. And if there was a script, then someone had written it. I went straight home and pulled out every document I had related to the property. Purchase agreements, HOA bylaws, Land maps, anything that could tell me what that piece of land really was. It didn't take long before I realized something important. The cemetery wasn't just a historical site. It was specifically referenced in the original land division records. It had been marked as protected ground, excluded from any development use no matter who owned the surrounding property. Which meant the HOA didn't just make a mistake, they ignored something they absolutely should have known. But that raised an even bigger question. If the records were that clear, how did they get away with starting construction in the first place? That's when I started digging deeper. The county office wasn't too far, and by mid-morning I was already sitting across from a clerk who looked like she'd seen just about everything. I gave her the parcel number and asked for any recent filings or changes tied to it. She hesitated for a moment, typing quietly, then frowned at her screen. There was a reclassification request filed a few months ago. She said, "You labeled that section as inactive land." I felt my jaw tighten. Inactive doesn't mean empty, I replied. She nodded slightly. No, it doesn't. But if no one contests it during the review period, it can sometimes go through without much attention. And there it was. That was the window they used. Quiet paperwork, filed months in advance, slipping through unnoticed while everyone went about their daily lives. No big announcement. No obvious red flags, just a technical change buried in a stack of documents most people would never think to check. They hadn't just assumed no one would notice. They made sure of it. I asked for a copy of the filing, and as I read through it, the details only made it worse. The language was vague, almost deliberately so. It referenced land with no active visitation and no recent maintenance records, carefully avoiding any direct mention of graves, markers, or the cemetery designation. It was written in a way that turned something sacred into something forgettable. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated who might take the time to look. Back at home, I compared the new filing with the original land records side by side. The difference was undeniable. The cemetery hadn't disappeared, it had been relabeled, quietly and strategically, into something easier to erase. And once that label changed, everything else followed. Permits, approvals, construction schedules, all built on a foundation of half-truths. By late afternoon, messages were already spreading through the neighborhood. Photos I had taken were circulating, and the reactions were shifting from confusion to anger. People who had lived here for years suddenly realized what had been done right under their noses. Some recognized names from the broken headstones. Others just couldn't believe something like this could happen at all. And still, the HOA hadn't said a word. No apology. No explanation. Nothing. That silence told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't an oversight they planned to fix. It was something they hoped to finish before anyone could stop them. They thought once the land was cleared and the golf course expanded, it would be too late, just another completed project no one could undo. But as I sat there, surrounded by documents and evidence they never expected anyone to piece together, one thing became clear. They didn't just hide the truth. They built their entire plan on the belief that no one would ever go looking for it. And now that I had, there was no turning back. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about carelessness or a rushed decision. It was about something they never expected anyone to challenge. The more documents I laid out in front of me, the more the pieces started to align in a way that felt deliberate, almost rehearsed. Every form, every filing, every quiet approval followed a pattern. It wasn't clean enough to be legal, but it was just subtle enough to pass unnoticed. But patterns always leave traces. I started cross-referencing names, board members, signatories, the individuals who approved the reclassification request. It didn't take long before familiar names began appearing again and again. People who sat on the HOA board were also listed in development committees. Others had connections to the contractor company now tearing through the cemetery. It wasn't direct enough to raise immediate alarms, but it was close enough to make one thing obvious. This wasn't random. It was coordinated. That realization changed everything. Up until that moment, part of me still hoped there had been some kind of mistake buried somewhere in the process, a missed document, a miscommunication. But this, This was intent. Quiet, calculated intent. I needed something stronger than suspicion. So I went further back. The original land deed became my focus again. But this time I wasn't just reading it, I was analyzing every clause, every restriction, every line that could have been overlooked or intentionally ignored. That's when I found it. Buried in the language of the document was a section that hadn't been mentioned in any of the newer filings. It clearly stated that the cemetery land was not only protected but legally separated from the surrounding properties in a way that restricted any governing body, including future associations, from altering its purpose under any circumstances. Under any circumstances. I read that line 3 times just to be sure. That wasn't vague wording. That wasn't open to interpretation. That was absolute. Which meant everything the HOA had done, the reclassification, the construction approval, the expansion plans, was built on a foundation that had no legal standing at all. And yet, they moved forward anyway. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the papers spread across my desk. For the first time since this started, the anger I felt shifted into something colder, more focused. Because now it wasn't just about what they had done, it was about what they thought they could get away with. They didn't just try to hide the truth. They gambled that no one had the authority to challenge them. That's when it hit me. I pulled out another folder, one I hadn't opened in years. Inside were documents tied to my own property papers I had kept more out of habit than necessity. But as I flipped through them, my pulse started to rise again. This time for a completely different reason. Because there it was, a clause tied to the original land distribution. One that connected my property directly to the protected section of land. It wasn't obvious at first glance, but once I followed the references and cross-checked the parcel numbers, the connection became undeniable. My land wasn't just adjacent to the cemetery, it was part of a larger legal framework that gave me standing. Not just as a resident, but as someone with enforceable rights tied to how that land was treated. They hadn't just ignored the law. They had ignored me. And they had no idea. I could feel the weight of that realization settle in. All the confidence they showed. All the silence from the board. All the dismissive responses, they came from one assumption. That no one with real authority would step forward. But they were wrong. I gathered every document, every piece of evidence, and organized it carefully. This wasn't something to rush. If I moved too quickly, they'd try to cover their tracks, twist the narrative, or bury the truth even deeper. No, this needed to be precise. Because when I confronted them, it wouldn't be with questions. It would be with proofs. And the moment they saw it, the moment they realized exactly what they had overlooked, everything would change. Turning the tables on the entire neighborhood didn't happen with a dramatic confrontation or a heated argument in some HOA meeting room. It started quietly, the same way their plan had started on paper, with signatures, clauses, and laws they thought no one understood well enough to use against them. I didn't go back to the construction site the next day. I didn't call the HOA board or demand an emergency meeting. Instead, I sat down with everything I had gathered and made one decision. If they wanted to play this game through technicalities and buried documents, then that's exactly where I would meet them. But I wasn't going to play small. The connection between my property and the protected cemetery land wasn't just symbolic, it carried legal weight that extended further than they realized. The original land structure wasn't designed the way modern developments are. It wasn't cleanly divided into independent lots controlled entirely by an HOA. It was layered, with certain rights and controls tied to specific parcels, some of which had never been fully transferred or rewritten when the association was formed. They built their authority on the assumption that everything fell under their control. It didn't. And once I confirmed that with a property attorney, the strategy became clear. I didn't need to argue about what they had done, I needed to show what they no longer had the right to control. So I filed the first notice. It wasn't aggressive in tone, but it was absolute in its implications. A formal legal notice asserting my rights over the protected land and challenging every action they had taken regarding the cemetery. It cited the original deed, the restrictions they violated, and the improper reclassification that allowed the construction to begin in the first place. But that was just the beginning. Because once that foundation was established, everything connected to it became vulnerable. The golf course expansion, the land beneath it, the shared property agreements tied to the neighborhood, all of it was built on a framework that depended on the HOA maintaining lawful authority. The moment that authority was compromised, the entire structure started to crack. And I made sure those cracks spread. The second set of filings went further. They questioned the HOA's jurisdiction over multiple parcels, including residential areas tied to the same original land agreement. It wasn't something most homeowners had ever looked into. And why would they? They trusted the system they were part of. They assumed the rules they followed were legitimate, just like I had until now. Within days, the first responses started coming in. Confusion at first, then concern. People began receiving notices they didn't fully understand, referencing legal disputes and potential changes to property control. Some thought it was a mistake. Others started asking questions the HOA couldn't answer quickly enough. And that's when the balance began to shift. The same board that had ignored calls and avoided accountability was suddenly scrambling. Emails went out, trying to reassure residents that everything was under review. Meetings were scheduled, then rescheduled. Statements were drafted but never fully explained anything. Because they couldn't. Admitting the truth meant admitting they had overstepped in a way that put the entire neighborhood at risk. But the most powerful moment came when the legal notices escalated. Eviction authority isn't something that appears out of nowhere. It comes from ownership, from rights that are clearly defined and enforceable. And as extreme as it sounded, those rights had been sitting there all along, tied to agreements no one had revisited in years, agreements they had just violated. So when the first official warnings went out, formal, undeniable, backed by the same legal system they had tried to sidestep, it hit harder than anything else. Doors that had never seen anything but routine HOA letters were now receiving documents that carried real consequences. Panic replaced confusion almost overnight. Neighbors who once supported the expansion, or simply didn't question it, were now facing the reality of what had been done in their name. The golf course project that seemed like a harmless upgrade suddenly became the center of a growing crisis. And the HOA, they were no longer in control. They had pushed forward thinking they held all the power, that they could reshape the land and silence any opposition. But in doing so, they exposed weaknesses they didn't even know existed. Weaknesses I now understood completely. I never raised my voice. I never made a public scene. I didn't have to. Because by the time they realized what was happening, the tables had already turned and there was nothing they could do to flip them back. Eviction notices that shook the community didn't arrive with noise or warning, they arrived in silence. Slipped into mailboxes and posted on doors in crisp envelopes that carried more weight than anyone was prepared for. At first, people thought it had to be a mistake. HOA disputes happened. Fines happened. Even legal disagreements weren't unheard of. But this was different. This wasn't a warning about lawn maintenance or late fees. This was something far more serious. Written in clear, formal language that left no room for misinterpretation. I remember watching from a distance as the first reactions unfolded. A man across the street opened his letter, skimmed it once, then again, his posture stiffening with every line. A woman 2 houses down stepped outside with her phone pressed to her ear, her voice rising in confusion as she tried to make sense of what she was reading. Within hours, the entire neighborhood was buzzing, not with rumors this time, but with shared disbelief, because the notices were real. They weren't threats or empty gestures meant to scare people into compliance. They were backed by legal filings, tied directly to the same authority the HOA had relied on for years without question. The difference was that authority had now shifted. The agreements they had ignored, the restrictions they had violated, had triggered consequences none of them saw coming. And now, everyone was feeling it. The HOA board tried to respond quickly, but for the first time, their usual tactics didn't work. They couldn't issue a simple statement and move on. They couldn't hide behind vague explanations or procedural delays. Every resident who received a notice had proof in their hands, documents that referenced specific clauses, original land agreements, and legal rights that overruled anything the HOA claimed to control. Emergency meetings were called, but they only made things worse. Residents demanded answers the board couldn't give. Some members tried to downplay the situation, insisting it was temporary or under legal review. But their uncertainty showed. Others sat in silence, knowing exactly how serious it had become, but unable to admit it without exposing the truth. Because the truth was unavoidable now. The cemetery they had dismissed as unused land wasn't just protected, it was central to a legal framework they had disrupted. And by crossing that line, they hadn't just caused damage to a historic site. They had destabilized the very structure that gave them authority over the neighborhood in the first place. Families who had supported the golf course expansion, or simply didn't question it, were now facing the consequences alongside everyone else. It didn't matter who voted for what or who stayed silent. The actions of the HOA board had tied everyone into the fallout, and there was no easy way out. Some people tried to appeal, reaching out in desperation, hoping for a quick resolution. Others grew angry, directing that anger at the board members who had approved the project without understanding the risks. Long-standing friendships between neighbors started to fracture under the pressure, as blame spread just as quickly as the news. And through it all, the construction site sat abandoned. The machines that had once torn through the ground were gone, leaving behind a scar that no one could ignore. The broken remains of the cemetery had been partially covered again, but the damage was done. It stood as a constant reminder of where this all began, a single decision that should never have been made. The final blow came when legal enforcement moved forward without delay. Deadlines were set. Compliance was demanded. The same system the HOA had relied on to control others was now operating against them, with far less patience and far more authority. That's when reality fully set in. The board members who once acted with confidence were nowhere to be found. Some resigned quietly. Others avoided public appearances altogether. The organization that once dictated rules and enforced them without hesitation was now collapsing under the weight of its own actions. They had destroyed 12 graves to build something new, believing progress would cover their tracks and justify their choices. But in the end, all they built was their own downfall. And as the community stood divided, shaken, and forever changed, one thing became painfully clear to everyone who lived there. Some lines aren't just meant to be respected. They were meant to never be crossed.